I recognize that we are in the midst of a political, social upheaval, and there are people who are concerned for their financial interest, people who are concerned about the state of education in our nation, people are concerned about racial tensions and the racial divide within the United States. People are concerned about whether or not they will have the kinds of vocations that allow them to earn and maintain families. Young people are concerned with whether or not their future is now at risk, and there are some who, while not suffering, they're celebrating. I'm submitting to you that no matter what side of the polemic aisle you fall on, this is not the time to panic. This is not the time to bite your nails, pull your hair out, and pretend as if somehow you don't know the God who has brought you this far. This is not the time to act as if the sky is falling and somehow we should just all give up, circle the wagons until the Lord returns. No. This is not the time. This is not the time to panic. And Jesus says essentially the same thing in this text. The reason I had for Psalms 132 read to you is because I wanted you to see how in the Hebrew mind the temple and the temple grounds were so celebrated. In fact, there were people who believed that God actually lived in Jerusalem, that Jerusalem was his resting place, that God's dwelling place was there inside the city of David. And one of the things that made its destruction so hard for them was that they somehow concluded that the destruction of the city was actually the destruction of their God. And Jesus was trying to help them to recognize you are in a tough situation. And one day it's going to get a little bit tougher. But what I don't want you to do is to look at these things and panic. It's strange because they don't raise it. Somehow he, in his conversation with them, they have made this connection. Jesus doesn't raise it. They do. This connection between the end of the temple and the end of time. And there's a difference between the end of your world and the end of the world. And for some of us, we seem to think that the end of our world is the end of the world. And Jesus was pointing to the demolition of the temple to say to them, the thing that you are secure in may crumble. But when that happens, you need to relax because God is still in control. In the ancient mind, in the ancient world, Josephus in his War of Antiquities describes the beauty of the temple. And Josephus reminds us that the temple was overlaid with pure gold. Such was the gold that framed the outer portion of the temple that when the sun rose and hit the gold on the temple, the flash was so blinding that if you wanted to look at the temple, you couldn't. You had to look away. The stones that made up the compound of the temple as well as the temple itself, some of them weighed in excess of 100 tons. The ways in which Solomon first and then Herod in his rebuilding of the temple were able to align stones, fit them so tight without cement and still preserve throughout thousands of years remains an architectural marvel. To this day, there's no contractor, no architect who could design it and no construction crew that could lift it. These were stones of enormous size, mammoth in their capacity, and pure white marble. So clean, so clear, so white, so bedazzling that from a distance when strangers were on their way to Jerusalem, they looked at the city, they looked at the temple and assumed that it was a snow-capped mountain. And between the gold and between the white marble, it was a feat of magnificence. And Jesus says, one day, as glamorous as this is, one day every stone will be torn apart and it will lay in ruins. One day when Rome was being the occupying force in the city of Jerusalem, many of the people ran to the temple for security because they thought that this was the place that would save them. And one Roman soldier, antiquity reveals, in a drunken state set the temple on fire. And as a result of the intensity of the flames, the gold in the structure melted and seeped into the cracks of marble. When the Romans overlord came through, what they did was they pulled the stones apart piece by piece, chipped it away to get at the gold, and the temple lay in ruins. There were some people who come to church because they find a sense of security, and I think that's appropriate. But you need to know your security can't be in a building, because the church is not a facility. The church is people. And those people have placed their faith in Christ. And one day, anything other than Christ that you have placed your faith in will fail you. Jesus is trying to help them. And Jesus recognizes that there is something about their ability to see through the times in which they live that they are missing. Notice in verse 1 how he frames this out even further, or better still in verse 2. Jesus replied, yes, look at these great buildings, but they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. And later, Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives across the valley from the temple. And Peter, James, John, and Andrew came to him privately and asked, tell us, when will this happen? What sign will show us what these things are about, that these things are about to be fulfilled? Go back to and look at verse 1. As Jesus was leaving the temple that day, one of his disciples said, teacher, look at these magnificent buildings. Look at the impressive stones and walls. And this is perhaps redundant, but have you ever noticed how what impresses people doesn't impress God? That God is not impressed by what impresses most of us. That he has a different way of grading what is important and what is magnificent. Back down to this verse in which Jesus says to him, they raise the question, when will this happen? Jesus is clear that in light of what you will be confronting, I want you to realize that you do not have to panic. And it doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office. It doesn't matter who the supervisor is over your department. It doesn't matter who the manager is over your company. This is not the time for you to pretend like you don't know who made a way out of no way. For you to pretend you don't know who's brought you this far by faith. For you to act as if somehow you don't know the one who's regulated the beats of your heart and captured the amount of oxygen you'll consume. This is the same God who has brought us thus far along the way. And now is not the time to act like we don't know who he is. He's demonstrated a track record of care for you that is beyond refute. You can't argue about how good God has been in spite of your madness. When we were crazy, God kept us. When we were lonely, he held us. When we were powerless, he empowered us. When we were confused, he gave us clarity. Now, why are you going to act like now you don't know who brought you? It's strange to me because as I read this, he says to them several things, and this is complicated because they ask one question and he doesn't give them one answer. He meanders around these issues of how they should be on watch, how they should be on guard. And the thing that he's clear about is found in verse 32. He says, however, no one knows the day or the hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself, only the Father knows. Since you don't know when that time will come, be on guard, stay alert. Now, you should always be wary of anybody trying to predict when Christ will return or the end of the age. Whoever that is, they ought to be marked, and you ought to look at them with one eye open because the text says nobody knows. And I don't care who the preacher is from Mississippi or the Bishop Lightbulb from Tupelo, who you respect and revere, nobody knows. And in every generation, there have been charlatans and hirelings who tried to pretend they could predict the return of the Lord, and all of them have failed. And there have always been false messiahs, from Eva Frank to Daddy Grace to Father Divine to Richard Pryor as Daddy Rich. There have always been this conglomerate of pseudo-messiahs pretending to be somebody. And Jesus says, don't sweat it when that occurs. Don't worry about it. That is not the sign of the end. What I want you to do is I want you to be on guard, and I want you to watch. In the text, properly translated, is not watch in terms of what's happening so that I can see it. Watch internally what's going on inside of me, because there are some situations that, if you don't know who you are, can shake you to the core of your faith. So keep an eye not only on the external things, but I want you to watch out, watch yourself. Don't study international affairs more than you study who you are. Don't study what's happening in the political arena more than cosmic conflict. Study the conflict that's going on in your own heart. And I want you to be on guard, because I want you to be watching so that you know when you are confronted with what it is you must confront, you will be able to stand with the assurance that I'm still God, and that I can keep you, I can hold you, I can move you forward. There's something happening in this passage that I don't want to miss. Because not only does he not want you to panic, he wants you to realize that there's a kind of pressure and a kind of persecution that is never going to be a sign of the end. You ought to just expect it. That somehow what happens to us is a part of living in a fallen creation. I am somewhat jaded with men and women who, every time there's an earthquake, claim the Lord or the end of the age is about to occur. I am jaded with men and women who claim every time there's a famine or a war, the world is about to end in destruction. That is not true now, and you need to be clear that it's not true. We have had wars, we have had famines, we have had earthquakes, and we will have more of them. They are not signs of the end of time. Ever since man has been a part of this planet, ever since man has been a part of this fallen creation, we have recognized that there are seismic, geographical, physical, social upheavals. There have always been religious cults. There have always been social upheavals like war. Why? Because the heart of man is greedy. The heart of man is wicked. The heart of man is prideful. And wars have been a part of our culture as human beings since the beginning. There will always be physical catastrophes like earthquakes. You don't read them as signs of final judgment. They are not signs that the end of the world is close. In fact, Jesus was even clearer. He said, don't sweat it, don't panic. These are just birth pangs. And it doesn't matter what Donald Trump does. It doesn't matter what any other elected official does. It doesn't matter what Mr. Putin does. The truth, as God has revealed it to us, is that these things are a part of what it means to live on this planet. And this is not the time to panic, but it's also interesting in the way Jesus doesn't give them what they want. Because Jesus often will not give you what you want. Do you know what they want? They want a specific date. They want a specific time. They want to know, tell us when these things will occur. And Jesus gives them this protracted response, because what they don't know is that that's none of their business. When the end will come should not be my concern, and it should not be your concern. We shouldn't be concerned about when the end comes. We ought to be concerned about living all we know right now, no matter when the end comes. If the end comes tonight, the question you ought to be asking is, are you ready? In a strange way, God doesn't give them what they want. He just kind of gives them what they need. This is a mixtape of signs. Some of them are true, some of them are false, some not a false single significance to any one of them that tells them what they want to hear. He just gives them instructions. And he lays out for them in more than 30 verses some nuances of how to discern tough times. And here's what I would suggest. You need to be able to see. That's the term utilized in the King James Version. When you see, he's talking about not seeing what is apparent. He's talking about seeing through. Sometimes you got to be able to see through circumstances in order to get past the facade. You see, always there is this ability for present splendor to disguise future destruction. You're looking at what looks good right now, but what you don't know is that the end of it won't always look that good. And so you've got to be able to peer through it. That's what Jesus was going after. How do you look through these things to recognize who I am and why you need to just trust me in all of this? He doesn't give them what they want. He gives to them what they need. He gives them instructions on how to discern so they will not be disturbed or disheartened by what they see or what they hear. Which is why there's some things you see and some things you hear. And in uncertain and trying times, sometimes you have to be careful how much weight you assign to it. There have always been false prophetic voices. There have always been false prophetic voices. False prophetic voices are not new. And in tough times, you need to be able to identify what is a false prophetic voice from a voice that has accuracy with it. And I need to tell you that just because somebody mentioned the Bible doesn't mean they preaching the Bible. And just because somebody talks about God doesn't mean they have a relationship with God. And just because somebody sounds spiritual doesn't necessarily mean they are. In fact, if I was the devil, that's how I would trick you. I wouldn't come at you like a monster because I know you'd run. So I wouldn't come at you with fangs and talons. I'd come at you as an angel of light. And that's why sometimes you got to turn off your TV. Because everybody on television claiming to preach the gospel is not. And I'm not just talking, I'm talking about some too who I have revered but recognize the limits of their theology or their integrity. I can't figure out which it is. Because when I hear you every week address everything except the issues that are taking place, and never applying a biblical application to the issues of racism and poverty and sexism and discrimination, I often wonder, what book are you reading? Because the Bible that I read tells me that I serve a God who loves justice. And I want to figure out, why aren't you concerned about it as well? False prophetic voices become a part of the sign of the end time. Every generation has had to deal with this. Now, don't read signs as a final judgment. But here's the corrective that you must embrace. If you're not going to read signs of the times as a final judgment, you could develop a kind of cool, cavalier, nonchalant attitude that's also detrimental. The fact that you know that these are not signs of the end don't allow you to not be concerned. Jesus said, don't be troubled. He didn't say, don't be concerned. When people are caught in the wake of natural disaster, like earthquakes, famines, when people are caught in the upheavals of war, you are supposed to be concerned. You're not supposed to be troubled, but you're supposed to be concerned. And a part of who we are as people who serve Christ is to not walk around as if it's all good and it's fine. No. We don't turn a deaf ear to the cries of the desperate just because we know Jesus. And we don't ignore the fact that there are people who are hungry by telling them we're only concerned about their souls. A body without a spirit is a corpse. A spirit without a body without a spirit is a corpse. A spirit without a body is a spook. You must be concerned about both, the body and the spirit. And it's not enough for you to be concerned about people going to heaven and not be concerned about the housing they live in. And so Jesus makes it clear that I don't want you to be troubled, but I'm not at all telling you that you shouldn't be concerned. And here's the thing that makes me go, wow. He tells them there's no need for you to panic now. And he essentially tells them there's no need for you to know when the end is either, because that's none of your business. A lot of people come up with this mysterious numerology and try to lay out these wonderful plans and show you when the end of the world will come. That's hogwash. That's hogwash. Nobody knows. And you should reject it. Nobody knows. Jesus doesn't give them the answer they want. He gives them what it is they need. And here's what I'm glad. In your life and in my life, here's what you've discovered. There are times when he doesn't give you what you want, but he always gives you just what you need. Do I have a witness? God doesn't always, he doesn't always give you everything you want, but he always gives and provides for you exactly what it is you need. And you know why I love him? Because even I don't know what I need. I think I do. But you see, I've asked for some things that I didn't get. Praise God. Because he knew you didn't know what you was asking for. You were just as nutty as a fruitcake. Just as tricked up as you could be, asking for what you thought you needed, but you really didn't know. And that's why you ought to sometimes look at your circumstance right now and say, Lord, I don't necessarily like where I'm at. I don't necessarily like what I'm experiencing. I don't particularly prefer this situation. But here's what I believe. I believe you gave me just what I need. And sometimes that situation is to drive you to him. Sometimes that situation is to unpack a sweetness and a grace that you've never experienced from God before. Sometimes it's a strength you didn't know you had access to, but God put you in that situation so that you could experience new things about him and see him with different eyes. He says to them, nope, you don't need to know. He says to them, I'm going to give you a promise. And here's where I want to sort of rest. If you look at this text in verse 9, it simply says, when these things begin to happen, watch out. You will be handed over to the local councils and beaten in the synagogues. And I believe he's talking to them about their situation, not necessarily ours. But I want to make an application. I believe he's talking to men and women in this day, in this case the disciples, who before long they will be persecuted. And they will stand before leaders and have to give an account, or better still, a declaration of faith. You say, it's easy to want unshakable faith. But the only way you can acquire unshakable faith is by being shook. You can't experience and develop unshakable faith without the shaking. People will say, well, you know, I wish I had the faith like Job. Well, okay, well, I've never prayed that prayer, but I just need you to go back and read the narrative and look at all that happened to Job that produced that faith. And so sometimes in church we speak in terms that are just rhetoric. because it's not tethered to thought. It is not tethered to understanding sometimes how God wants to work. Now, here's what I want you to be clear about. No, you can't get unshakable faith unless you are shook. But here's what I want to promise you. That if you are a child of God, there's some shaking you're going to have to endure. I am not a prosperity proponent, because what I recognize is that sometimes the way you grow most is through your pain. Sometimes pain becomes the thing that gets you to where God wants to get you. And you see, prosperity as a gospel tries to eliminate the pain process. And sometimes the only way I can grow in depth in terms of my faith is I got to hurt. I got to pass through some things. And their question to him, when will the signs be? His response to them in verse 9 is rather simple. One, you don't need to know that. I'm going to give you some things that are going to help you to discern so that you won't be completely disturbed by what you see and what you hear. But here's the tension. Because in verse 9, what he says to them is, oh no, you won't be delivered. You're going to go through. There is this concept of God that somehow he exists to give me a comfortable life. And there are two general categories in this text that you need to embrace. The one is general. He is talking to people and making it clear that there's a general kind of persecution that occurs. But there is another kind of persecution here in verse 9 that is specific. It is not general. It is not about famine. It is not about war. It is not about earthquakes. This persecution is specific, and it is for any woman, any man, any person who has decided to trust Christ. He says to us, when that is who you are, you will pass through times of persecution. Have you ever walked into a room and you haven't thrown anything at anybody? You haven't yelled at anybody? You haven't spoken to anybody? And you recognize there's a problem just because you showed up? Have you ever felt beef, tension with somebody having done nothing to them? And you walked around trying to figure out, what is it? Is it me? I'm here to tell you, it's not you. Because you are a Christian, you invite certain hostility. Because you're trying to live your life in a way that conforms to what Jesus has called you to do, it invites a kind of opposition. You haven't said anything wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. And there's nothing wrong with you except that one day you made a decision that you wanted Christ to superintend your life. And they despise you just for that. Why? Darkness can't stand it when light shows up. And when you've got the light of Christ in you, all you've got to do is appear, and darkness gets upset. And Jesus makes it clear, I won't deliver you from that. The promise here is not for deliverance. It is only that when you find yourself in that situation, the promise is, not only will I give you what to say, I'll be the one there, and in the midst of your moment of persecution, I'll provide a kind of inspiration and a kind of help while you're passing through that tough time. I don't know about you, but I'm so glad that I don't have to go through all by myself. Is there anybody else here glad that in the midst of your adversity, in the midst of your difficulty, there is somebody who stands with you, somebody who guards you, somebody who guides you, somebody who tells you what to do, what not to do. If I had to stand all by myself, I couldn't make it. But I can stand in a tough spot if I know I'm not alone. And if I know that somebody's got my back, even when my best friend runs off. If I know that there's somebody standing and holding me up, I can make it. That's what God has said to you. You don't have to panic. You don't have to bite your nails. You don't have to act like you don't know what's coming next. All you've got to know is that I'll be there in the hour of your trial, your persecution. I'll stand with you. I'll guide you. I'll strengthen you. And I'll give you what you need to survive. Is there anybody here that can say, I know you're right? Because I've been in that situation. And I closed my eyes waiting to hit the bottom. But underneath were the everlasting arms of God. I thought it was over, but I found a strength. And now I can smile again. I can laugh again. I can love again. I can be civil again. Because God has raised me up in the midst of my adversity and given me his strength. Is there anybody here that can say yes? That's who he is. And that's been his promise. What you do not have, he says, I'll give. And in the midst of your white hot trial, he has promised, I'll be there. And while I won't deliver you, what I'll provide for you is divine help and a testimony so that when you come out, you can tell somebody else. You can tell them.